I am Liz Powell, and I am the founder and head of G2G Consulting, which stands for Government to Growth. And today we are talking about raising your voice in Ohio and in DC, actually, but all tied to Ohio. You're going to learn about the state capital budget, which is just around the corner, policy issues, ways to run a very effective advocacy campaign, and so much more. So we're really excited to have you join us today. We have a special guest for today's webinar, Annelise Corbin, who is the founder, executive director, goddess of Past Foundation, which is an amazing STEM organization. I'm super excited to have you hear from her today, along with my awesome colleagues, Andrea Harless and Becky Watts. Why don't we move on to the next slide, please? So my job is to kick things off, give you a little bit of background, set the stage for what we're going to cover today, and then I'm going to pass to my colleagues. And when I do, would love each to give their background. So this is what I'm going to cover: G2G's background, the basics of government funding. Then we're going to get into the budget process and earmarks, which I know is very, very important for many folks. Advocacy tips and insights, targeting, making sure you're talking to the right people. Specific legal activity that is allowed for nonprofits. We get this question a lot, so we want to make sure we dedicated a whole section to that. And then we're going to get to hear from Annelise Corbin. We're very excited to hear from her experience of launching a government affairs engagement effort, how she's been successful in this effort, so you can get tips from her and hopefully apply the same to your organization. And then we'll close out with takeaways and Q&A. Next slide, please. So a little bit of background. So I used to work on the Hill in Washington. I was the legislative director for a couple of different members of Congress. Unfortunately, neither was from Ohio. I worked for a California member and a Rhode Island member, so totally different, two different sides of the country. But I also did a campaign work for Daggett from Colorado, so middle of the country. And I did a lot of health and social policy work. I managed all appropriations requests. I staffed some really interesting committees, one of which was Small Business Committee. The other was Armed Services Committee. I'm also an attorney. I have a master's in public health. And I started G2G because I met a lot of entrepreneurs as well as nonprofits who were doing great things, but didn't know how to access funding, make connections, shape policies in the most effective ways possible. And so then I thought, wow, G2G, government to growth, we can be that bridge. And that's exactly what we are. So you can see some of our stats on the right. We've raised over $320 million in non-dilutive funding. We've been very successful federal, state, and local level of government, and we've got offices Cleveland, Columbus, and DC. We are bipartisan, working across the aisle. In fact, almost everything we do is bipartisan, so it's a wonderful place to be in. We love our clients. All are working so hard to make a difference in the world. Next slide, please. These are some of the amazing folks we've worked with. There's actually many more. We just couldn't fit them all on a slide. But we wanted to point out everything from women's health to economic development, working municipalities, aerospace and aviation, innovation, worked with universities, worked with Boys and Girls Clubs, BioEnterprise, the whole BioOhio organization, museums, Rare Cancer Foundation, all kinds of different organizations. So next slide, please. So just a quick overview, Government 101. So there are funding measures that have to move through the legislative process. So the legislature is the one that writes those details. The governor or president signs into law once it passes both chambers. And then the courts interpret, is this actually constitutional? Is this in line with precedent, with legal precedent? So that's sort of a quick overview of the basics of government, but there's so much more that goes into it. There's lobbying, advocacy, media, knowing the right people, using the right messaging, using the right timing. Ohio has really some distinctive timing that I haven't seen in many other states, which I'm going to let my colleagues get into more detail. But there's so many pieces that come together. We want to make sure that you understand all those pieces of the puzzle. Give you a few more details on earmarks and the process, what to expect. That's the capital budget process that's really starting to get underway now. We've had some interesting conversations with the chairman recently. Becky's going to fill you in on. And then we're going to get right to Annelise and talking about her experience of launching a government affairs engagement effort. So with that, I will pass it over to Becky.
Thanks, Liz. I think Andrea is actually taking this one.
I think it's me.
Oh,
sorry,
Andrea.
I was slow to unmute my screen. It keeps freezing. wonders of Zoom. Anyways, my name is Andrea Harless. I work in G2G's office in Columbus, Ohio, right down the street from the State House. My background is in state government, so I worked in the state Senate for a couple of years, and then I also worked in the county health department here in Franklin County, which is very interesting. I learned a lot of things that I did not know would become so applicable during this pandemic. So learned a ton from both. And I've been with G2G for, I think it's like exactly 4 years this week, which is cool. It's my anniversary. And I do state, local, and federal work for G2G. So we're going to talk a little bit about this puzzle. I really love this puzzle. I think it's because when we were quarantined, I did a lot of puzzles because they're time consuming and fun. But if anyone's ever done a puzzle, you know that if you get to the end and you're missing one piece and your puzzle isn't complete, it's so frustrating because you spent so much time working on it and then you don't get the end result. And working with the government is exactly like that. You have to know all of these little pieces, things you don't think of. You know, I think people think you go to the state house, you talk to a couple legislators and you get your stuff. That's not what happens. You need to talk to agencies. You need to talk to leadership. You need to talk to your legislators. I know Becky's going to talk a little bit about targeting and how different targets are really important. You also just have to understand what's going on. Obviously, COVID is a current event that everybody on the planet knows about, but sometimes there's something happening at the State House or on the Hill that maybe you don't know because it's not, you know, all over the news all the time, and it does affect your messaging or who you're talking to, or sometimes who you're not talking to. That's really important to keep those in mind. Elections, when elections are coming up, sometimes again the message that you're putting forth is going to be a little bit different because there's an election coming up, or if someone's term limited, or if somebody is in a difficult election. You have to be thinking of all of these little things, and also thinking about your community. So it's not just what's going on at the State House or on the Hill, it's also what is happening around you and how your community feels about your project. Nonprofits do so much great work, and we know they have community support. And it's always really, really important for legislators to hear about that. So these are just some of those pieces that we like to think about when we're working with government. Then we're going to talk a little bit about the state capital budget. So this is a slide that has a lot of words on it, but what we want to lay out for you is what the state capital budget is. So Liz was talking about that interesting timing in Ohio. So Ohio has a biennial operating budget. So every 2 years we do our operating budget, and typically in the off year, so this upcoming year in 2022, which feels crazy that we're in 2022 already, we do a capital budget. So a capital budget is bricks and mortar projects. So no programmatic funding, nothing like that, just bricks and mortar projects. These have to be bondable. So an HVAC system, a new roof. Annelise can tell you about her beautiful new roof from the capital budget, projects like that. And we also need to have a nexus to the state for something like that, specifically a state agency. So you have to be a nonprofit, a college or university or state or local government in order to be eligible for something like this. And the difference between the capital budget, and I'll show a timeline as well that will help lay that out. The difference between the capital budget and the operating budget is that the capital budget is what we call a pre-negotiated bill. So when you're working with the operating budget, you have multiple chances to get in the budget. So if you're not in the House introduced version, you could get in an omnibus amendment. So when they put a bunch of amendments into one and amend the bill, you don't get in the House, that's fine. You can move over to the Senate, try and get in the Senate, try and get into their omnibus amendment. It is a long haul, but you have multiple chances to get in, or if you don't get enough money, to get your money, to get a little bit more money. The capital budget is not that way. So typically with the capital budget, you have to be doing those meetings and your submissions way beforehand so you can get in that first version, and then it moves really, really quickly. The other thing about the capital budget is that they ask for a bit more substance than they do for the operating budget. So it's really important for a successful capital budget ask that you have your support letters. We do support letters for the operating budget too, just because it's good for legislators to see you have the support, but that's more required for the capital budget. They need to know that you have that. You need to have your grassroots support. We always encourage tours and events when and if you can, of course. And you need the support of your regional economic development agency, I guess not agency, their organization. So they typically will make a list of their top projects and bring it to their delegation. And if you're on their list, you have a much better chance of getting in the actual bill. So I'm going to switch over this timeline here. And interestingly, this timeline is what the capital budget usually, the timeline for the capital budget usually is. And as you can see, it's a really short timeline. You are making your plans at the end of the year, and by January, you are turning those into legislators. And by February, they've already dropped the bill. Again, they've dropped the pre-negotiated bill, the bill that you have to already be in. So it moves fast and furious. But we recently were talking with Senator Dolan from the Cleveland area. He is the Senate Finance Chairman. And he said this year, they're going to do it a little differently and push that timeline out and probably not actually pass the capital budget until June. So still very important. You have a plan in place, still very important that you're working with your regional economic development organization now that you're making your plans or talking to your legislators. Legislators sometimes tend to be a creature of habit. So they may still ask for your forms to fill out and turn in next month or in February, even if the bill is pushed out, so they can have time to put that together. But the timeline will look a little different this year, but most important thing to take away from this is it will probably still be a very, very quick process that we should start working on now. And I don't know if Becky has anything to add, because she's the one that had the conversation with Senator Dolan. Becky, if you have anything to add.
No, that's right, Andrea. And we literally just learned this, 2 days ago, about them potentially pushing out the capital budget until June. He did mention that the House of Representatives the Ohio House is looking at delaying it even further. But to Andrea's point, we want to have, if you're pursuing a capital budget request, community project request, it does sound like those will be included again, which is important to know. They're not always included. From what I've seen, most of the regional economic development organizations are still moving forward with their current deadlines, which are pretty much about now, and legislators may still want to proceed with their process over the course of the next 2 months to have everything, their priorities determined and submitted or ready to submit to their the chairman of their Senate and Finance caucuses. So those just some intel on the timeline, but it really just it gives us another few weeks to collect support letters, that type of thing. But highly recommend continuing to, if you're pursuing this route, continue doing your planning and as you would have been normally for a earlier deadline.
And another piece I just thought of, we were talking to another legislator last week who gets a lot of capital budget requests, especially like the Cleveland, Columbus, Cincinnati's of the world, of the state, I guess, are getting a lot of capital budget requests. And he was telling us his days are just capital budget meeting, capital budget meeting, capital budget meeting, a bunch of them. So it's really good to get those meetings in early because you want to be higher on their list. It gives you more time to get your messaging across and to tell them why you need it. And when they just start getting too busy, especially when session gets crazy and committees get crazy, they just don't have the bandwidth to do the meeting. So getting your meetings in early is really important as well.
Well, if I could just add one other point that I thought was very interesting in talking to Senator Chairman Dolan last week, understanding the competitive nature of these, he shared with me the stat that last cycle, for example, Cuyahoga County, he's from Northeast Ohio, so he was talking about Cleveland specifically. Cuyahoga County and the other urban areas are similar in nature, got about $23 million for capital budget projects, which was the highest among urban areas. However, there was almost $190 million worth of requests for community projects for Cuyahoga County. So again, it's a very competitive process, which is why we recommend all the sort of the bullet points of steps we do in terms of doing all this outreach now, having your ducks in a row, having your support letters, looking at all those puzzle pieces that Andrea mentioned earlier, seeing where you can leverage your networks, your boards, et cetera, to help get that funding in the bill.
Yeah, it's a great point. And if you're not in a big area, Cleveland, Columbus, Cincinnati, when I worked in the Senate, I worked for an office out of like the Youngstown, kind of Ashtabula area. It wasn't that our office was not getting a lot of requests. We got a lot of requests in that office, but they're just giving significantly less funding to those areas. So even if you're in the small areas, it doesn't mean that it's less competitive. It could be more competitive in some ways because it's a lot of projects for a lot less money. Okay, so moving on, we're just going to plug this really quickly. We will probably do another webinar on the state operating budget, which will happen in 2023. And I know you're thinking, why are we talking about this in November of 2021? But Annelise could probably speak to this too. The planning that you do for a budget is happening 6 months to a year in advance. You have to be thinking about these things now and start making friends with your legislators now. If you've never met them before, great time to start talking to them. So we will probably do, we will definitely do a webinar next year on the operating budget for 2023. But just a little thing to keep in the back of your mind. If capital budget maybe doesn't apply to you, operating budget probably does. So you can start thinking about that now. Now I will pass to Becky.
Thanks, Andrea. I'm Becky Watts. I've been with G2G for nearly 14 years. I started working with Liz and G2G after coming off of Capitol Hill. After I worked for, so I was in our DC office at the time. I've since moved to our Midwest office in Ohio, in the Cleveland area. But at the time, I had just come from working on Capitol Hill for 6 years for then Senator and now Governor Mike DeWine as his appropriations director. So that was a time period when we were doing earmarks in the federal budget, and Senator DeWine at the time was serving on the appropriations committee, and so we were getting requests from organizations like you from all over Ohio for funding in the federal appropriations bills, and I helped coordinate that effort. There are 12 appropriations bills, all of which at the time included earmarks of varying sizes and scopes for individual nonprofits. And you can see on the eligibility piece, the colleges, universities, state, local government entities. Even at that time, they were doing some for profits in the defense bills, primarily. Then Congress instituted a ban for 8 or so years on earmarks. There were a few bad apples in the earmark world that got a lot of negative press, and so they instituted a ban on earmarks. However, this past Congress, they reinstated the process of federal earmarks, and they did so kind of at the last minute, early in this calendar year, and so not as many organizations knew about the process. So they've changed the process, however, since the early 2000s, if you knew about it back then, in that, again, for-profits are no longer eligible. The goal of the process now is to be as transparent as possible. So they have, every request that every congressman or woman makes has to be listed on their website for everybody to see. Okay, what is Senator Brown requesting? What is Senator Portman requesting, for example? And additionally, there are limits on the numbers of requests that they can make. So what qualifies? 1-year funding request, having matching dollars. In many cases, it depends on the federal program you're pursuing, but that, generally speaking, is helpful. Programming, equipment, or construction. Again, that depends on, you have to know your account that you're pursuing, or at least talk to your congressional office about, okay, these are my organization's needs. Do they fit in a particular account? It's helpful if you have some background going into those conversations on the what's eligible or what accounts are available for earmarking. But your congressperson's office, district office, et cetera, should be able to help guide you through that process as well. And some of that they do post online for you to read through. How much funding can you request? It really ranges. We put here $50,000 to $3 million. We will see some that are even larger than that, but generally for nonprofit organization, we would recommend that range. And again, it kind of depends on the account you're pursuing. What makes a successful budget ask? So again, this sort of goes back to knowing your congressperson's priorities and understanding what it is they are trying to fix or address, what issue they're trying to address within their district, or just making a compelling case for the need for what your organization is doing. So, community support, broad community support can certainly be helpful. And again, alignment with that member's priorities. And again, developing that relationship, as Andrea said, with the congressional office long term. They have every congressional office has a district office in the district on the ground. They're, most of them are still doing Zoom meetings, not meetings on the Hill. So you can meet with their policy staff in DC pretty easily now. You don't even have to go. Annelise will talk about, we don't even have to go to DC this particular round to get the earmark that is currently residing in the House Labor, Health and Human Services and Education bill for Pass Foundation. Now we're at the mercy of the congressional sort of gridlock with the appropriations process. So we're kind of waiting that out. But key timing to know about is, again, right now is kind of when you want to be doing your planning, having your early conversations with those congressional offices. Generally, member deadlines for you to submit a request is February, March timeframe for you to submit a request to them, and then they have to submit their priorities. The members of Congress have to submit to the subcommittees, and then you'll see, you'll learn through them whether or not you made it onto that list. Then when the actual subcommittees, the individual 12 subcommittees, mark up their legislation or move it forward through the process, that's when you find out if you made it into the bill, that version of the bill. And so that's kind of where we are with Annelise and Pass. They are in the bill. The bill passed the House of Representatives and is now we're waiting on what's going on in the Senate. So typically we see some type of a omnibus bill wrapping a number of the appropriations bills into one in December. We'll see if that happens. Right now they're talking about a continuing resolution. In other words, funding the government at current levels into next year, so which would wipe out earmarks. So we're hopeful that they can actually negotiate something better than that. Next slide, please. Keys to effective advocacy. So we've talked a lot about this already. In terms of targeting, we like this slide because it kind of shows a stepping stone. Number one, you have to assess your own needs. Like what are your organization's biggest needs and that align with what's government's trying to address. Pass Foundation, for example, is doing a lot. It does a lot in the STEM education world. Particularly in the field of getting, underrepresented folks into the fields of STEM. And so that's what aligns well with what a lot of people in Congress are looking at. And if they're not, they should be. STEM is, has such a long-term return on investment in terms of our communities and workforce pathways, et cetera. And so getting more youth at an early age involved in that is sort of what we looked at for Pass Foundation. So that's your assessment of your needs. Number one, your targeting. It's really helpful to lay out exactly who you're talking to, who you should be talking to. As was mentioned earlier, it's not only the member of Congress that represents you specifically. Perhaps your organization hits surrounding communities and counties. There's a lot of other members of Congress there, or in the State House, there's a lot of other members of the legislature that you can be talking to. Understanding the leadership. Who can you be talking to within leadership? I mean, perhaps you live in a community or your organization serves a community that is only represented in the state legislature, for example, by members of the minority party. Well, the minority party in the state legislature does not have as very much power, unfortunately. I mean, it's very important to have relationships there, but there is a supermajority of Republicans in the Ohio State House currently. So it's very important that your message gets across to that party and that they understand what your organization is, who you serve, what you do, why it has a bigger reach. Messaging, you really want to get your concise messaging down, making sure your story is laid out, your need, the problem you're trying to address, the solution you're proposing, the results you expect, why partnering with government is would be so impactful. Outreach to those you serve, the community, your board, donors, and the media. Again, important pieces of the puzzle, getting folks from your board to weigh in with, people they know. Engagement with the decision makers at meetings, tours, and events. This was mentioned. If you can get legislators, decision makers out to your site, that is very helpful for them to see exactly what you're doing. And then, of course, follow up. You want to make sure you're keeping that drumbeat of communication going. I think I just reviewed most of this, sorry, in my targeting. Your legislators leadership, again, committee leadership, that is key. Understanding who, when we talk about these budgets, for example, in the Ohio State House, finance chairman, finance ranking member, making sure, sometimes we just talk to everybody on the whole finance committee to make sure they're aware, or the subcommittee of jurisdiction, to make sure they're very aware of the project and the process, or the project or the programmatic proposal, for example. Federal, this is appropriations bill. There's many committees that can be impacted. Caucuses they're not formal committees. They're not passing legislation, but they're definitely elevating issues and highlighting issues, and getting, offering opportunities for outside organizations to come in and describe the problem that they're trying to address. So caucuses can be a really effective way to work with both Congress and/or the State House. And then departments and agencies, do not ever forget the governor's office. Certainly, governor, lieutenant governor has regional staff all throughout the state of Ohio. They also have policy staff in Columbus. They work directly with the agencies, so getting to know those folks as well, and staying on the radar of that team. And they are always sort of the third between the House and the Senate and the governor's office. All three are in the room when final decisions are made on funding. And I think I'm turning this back to Liz.
Thanks, Becky. So this is just a quick slide on things you can and cannot do if you're a nonprofit. So the appropriate engagement, you can lobby. We get this question all the time. Yes, you definitely can lobby, and you can hire lobbyists. The key thing is watching your budget and what the percentage is of the cost of this effort. So as long as it's below 20%, you're totally fine. And by the way, the definition of lobby is basically the same thing as advocacy. It's just working to educate and influence the legislative process. So it's a pretty loose definition. That's federal, local level, all levels. Meeting with legislators and their staff, absolutely. You definitely want to be doing that. That's perfectly legal and needed. They need to hear from you. Tours, any kind of events to announce programs you're doing, all that's great, totally legal. Issues and levies. Levies are big in Ohio, and you can definitely step up and have your organization be pushing for different levy initiatives. That's totally legal. Voter registration drives, also perfectly legal. Right? As long as you're not telling them which way to vote, you can register them. Education activities, public forums, those are a great way to elevate the issues that you're working on. It's important, though, that you invite all candidates so that it truly is non-political event. What is inappropriate is having your organization endorse a candidate, having the organization write a check, organize a fundraiser, anything of that sort. No, no, no. However, you can do personal, private donations. You can go to events as an individual. So you could even host an event in your home. You just cannot say that it's your organization that's doing it. What's interesting, though, is that anything that's above $100, you actually have to write your employer. So it does get reported who your employer is if the check is above $100, but you cannot advertise anywhere that the organization is hosting it. And also you got to watch your emails. Really, it's much better to be using Gmail, Yahoo, whatever other account, not your nonprofit account. Not anything with .org should not be sending out any political events. If you receive it, that's fine because you received it. You can't control that, but you can't go proactively sending things out on a .org email address for a political event or an endorsement of any kind. So hopefully that's helpful. That creates some clear lines on what you can and cannot do. Next slide, please. And now we come to our guest speaker. We are so excited to be joined by Annelise Corbin. I'm going to do just a quick background on her. She is extremely impressive, was a professor before starting the PASS Foundation in 2005, and actually has a PhD in both history and anthropology. No, archaeology. I'm going to mess that up. Anthropology and history, right?
Close.
She was an
Yes.
underwater marine. I mean, just amazing background. There's like almost nothing she hasn't done. She's just amazing. And she's actually, her nickname is the goddess at the PASS Foundation because she's so passionate about STEM education. And their whole model of STEM education is truly unique. It's all about hands-on learning, problem solving. You got to see it to know it. And they've expanded out to lots of different models of doing this with different focus areas to really meet the interests of students. So just an amazing, inspiring leader in STEM. And what she's been able to do is to start this in Columbus, but really grow into a national presence. She's been recognized, and her organization's been recognized by President Clinton, President Obama. They've gotten all kinds of awards. They got the recent 50 Leaders Award within Columbus. I mean, she's just doing all kinds of exciting things locally, nationally, statewide. So with that, and please fill in anything that I got incorrect, but would love to have Annelise, share some of your thoughts, and then we'll have just a little bit of a conversation.
Excellent. Thank you so much for having me. So I'm very excited to be able to participate in this conversation today. The whole notion of nonprofit and advocacy was something that I knew we needed to do, but was not very knowledgeable about. And so have been ever grateful to be able to go on this journey and to have folks sort of standing with me at all times, as making some of those components work. So PASS Foundation has been around since 2000. We're a nonprofit. We're actually incorporated in the state of Montana. Our home office is in the state of Ohio, and we work all over the country and around the world. And so all of that adds a bit of complexity, if you will, into being able to sort of know where to fit, what to do, and all the different components. I'm thrilled to say that as we close out 2021 PASS Foundation and our work, we will have impacted just over 760,000 students as of the end of this year. And so we're incredibly, incredibly proud of the work that we've been able to do. So thank you for having me.
Awesome. Thank you so much for joining us.
Yeah.
So you have accomplished quite a bit in many ways, but especially in government affairs, which is what we're talking about today. And the next slide sums up some of these successes. So you've got this raised profile. You're really well known in government on the local level, state level, federal level. You've done all kinds of tours and events with different elected officials. Oof, look at all these different funding awards. You've got this pending federal earmark that Becky had mentioned earlier. You've got farm to school grant, state operating budget, state capital budget, a grant out of the Ohio Department of Higher Education. So with all of these different efforts producing these results, would love to know just what are your thoughts about what do you think was key to all the success? Like what could those who are listening take away from this?
I think, probably three things. The first one was being able to understand what the process was and what the process wasn't, right? And as I said earlier, that was not something I was overly comfortable with. I had zero experience in this aspect of the nonprofit world. I knew it was, wickedly important, but that didn't change the fact that I had no idea how to go about it. So part of it was just, having a really, really thorough understanding of the process and recognizing that process is ongoing. It's not a moment. I mean, I suppose for some that it could be, but what we recognized is that because of the nature of our work and the way that we were trying to scale and reach, we were going to need to be in the middle, if you will, of some type of state and federal process at all times, right? And so it's just this ongoing, it runs in cycles, definitely, but to be perfectly blunt, it almost seems like it never ends, right? And it's because it doesn't, because we're constantly working on it. So that was probably one of the first things that I learned. The second piece is that it is super, super complex, and it changes, right? It changes almost with the wind, if you will, to some extent, because, the different folks that come into office, especially if you think about sort of what goes on in Ohio, and people are shifting from the Senate to the House and, other different places. And so, one time I talked to this group and next time I talked to this group, and it's a changing cast of characters all the time, which means, back to the first point, you have to constantly be sort of in the space with the folks you're trying to talk to. So it's really, really important. And I think that the third piece to it is just really understanding, quite frankly, not just the process itself, but some of the sort of side or ancillary pieces that you really, really need to be aware of, as you're kind of going down that road. And capital, I think, is probably the most particular, right? Because there are aspects of, if you are get a capital award, there are pieces to that you may not understand. There's joint use agreements that have to be done. There's an entire state process. Just because the legislature says yes, it could take a really long time for those funds to actually show up to put the new roof on that you're so desperately needing, because you're moving buckets around your building, right? So we've lived that. And then there are other ancillary components to that as well. And so I think for me, it was just really having a better understanding of the complexity of this piece of our work. Necessary, but complex.
Okay, that's really helpful. And just in case there's some folks who don't have any government affairs engagement, when you think back when you were starting the organization, when did it first occur to you? And then what was it that you were thinking, ooh, I do need to do something with government?
Yes, I think for me, because of the way the Past Foundation works in particular, we apply for a lot of grants. So even prior to specific work tied to legislature, Ohio legislature or federal, we were already in the process of being an organization that applies for a lot of grants. And quite frankly, we had been in the sort of space where we were applying for a fair number of federal grants, very unsuccessfully, for a whole host of reasons. And it was really with that I recognized, part of the reason that we're unsuccessful is because we don't have the level of relationships that are necessary. We can do great work and we can be great on paper, and every once in a while that will hit and get you where you need to be, but the reality is you have to have an entire sort of group of advocates helping you, cheering you on, literally, going to the meetings with you, right, to be able to sort of change that dynamic. Because bottom line is, there are so many applicants to all of these different, federal or state funding opportunities, no matter what they happen to be, right? And so you have to, one of the things that, all of you were saying is you got to be at the front of that line, and you have to be there over and over again. It's a visibility piece, right? And changing your profile, that was the other component to it. But that was when we really realized that we needed help with the government component of our work.
Okay. And then when you started, did you have clear goals in mind of what you would get accomplished? And then how did what happened compare to that?
Yes, that's a great question. So, part of me very naively had no clue what the goals should be, right? Because you don't really have a true understanding, I think, of what's possible. And for me, that was certainly the case, right? I could read all the case studies. I had fabulous meetings with Liz. I remember the first time I met Liz. It's like, okay, this is all the things that are going to be happening or is possible. And you just sat there and listened to that and thought, oh, well, it would be spectacular if it is, but wow, that's an awful lot of stuff that I don't really understand the ins and outs of, right? And so that's where that sort of that component of having a guide makes a big difference. And then I think that the other piece is our organization also then had to both internally to the day-to-day operations and at the governance level of our organization had to do some shifting as well, quite frankly, to be successful with our government affairs work, quite frankly. So the staff had to understand the importance of it. And they also had to understand we had to start changing the way we gathered data, the way we told our story, the way that we were able to provide outcomes and measures in ways that maybe maybe we didn't normally do them because the audience we wanted to share this information with needed this information in either a different format or telling the story different or tied back to constituencies in ways that we hadn't necessarily done before. So that was an internal operating piece. And then at the governance level, the board level, we needed to put in place a government affairs committee within the board itself, right? And so that committee then could make sure that the board was lending the support that it needed to, had the expertise that the board could then go out. It's not just me or some of the other staff members of past going out and, if you will, pounding the pavement and shaking the hands and showing up at the State House. But the board itself was able to be educated about what they needed to do as well. And I have been incredibly fortunate because my board has individuals on the board that have a fair amount of government affairs experience themselves. That has made all the difference in the world.
Yeah. And did you find any overlaps with this work and your efforts to raise money? Was some of the messaging useful both places, or?
Oh, absolutely. Right. Because, once you get into the groove of understanding how the messaging, especially for the government, the legislature or the federal piece works, all of that messaging basically can be used over and over again. It can just be, tweaked and modified. And that has been one of the things that we have worked really hard on, is just being able to think of our marketing, if you will, right, or telling our story in a more comprehensive way. But the other piece I think that's been, really critically important in all of those, sorts of measures, I guess, if you will, is that we also needed to recognize that positioning matters, right? And so it was great that, for example, prior to the work that we engaged with G2G with, our schools knew who we were, right? Those boots on the ground sort of folks that we do our day-to-day work with. But that was not the case for the folks at the state level or at the legislature, or even within the counties or the cities and the communities in which we worked. And so one of the things we had to do was change our profile. And a really, really easy way, it was work, don't get me wrong, I'm not trying to minimize it, but the easy way to do that was to say, look, if we can change our profile within the legislature, within government, within the different agencies, actually, that we are working, that was going to be just that much more of that sort of lift taken care of.
Yep. Okay. So now I have an interesting question. So what did you love and what did you hate about this government engagement process?
I loved the fact that we were successful, right? That we were able to get the funding that we need. I mean, at the bottom line, right? That's one of the reasons that we went through this process is, so I did love the fact that we were able to be successful, that we were able to twice to earn capital dollars, which still just blows my mind. And I'm so excited and ever so grateful for that, because it made all the difference in the world for us. But the same with the programmatic, without question. But the other piece that I loved about it is that I feel so much more comfortable and confident about doing this work now. When I first started, it was a lot of time and early going, Becky, going places with me, or some of the other G2G staff going places with me, and I would allow them to speak, right? They were telling our story because I wasn't really sure exactly how to do it in that setting. I was great if I was standing on the floor at PAST, right? But you get me, in one of those legislative offices, and it's really unsure of the way you talk or have those different components. So I loved that. What did I hate? It's a lot of work. It's constant. It's seasonal, but there's no let up, right? You're always looking for the next piece of it. So that part's not always so fun. And sometimes it's also not so fun, when you get with a legislator that just doesn't want to see the story that you're trying to tell, I guess, if you will, right? And sometimes that happens.
Yeah. All right. Well, I think we're going to close out our little private Q&A unless there's any final thoughts you wanted to share.
One of the things that I have frequently said to my board as a nonprofit, you're constantly juggling dollars. That's the nature of the work that we're in. And there have been a few things over the last 5 or so years that I have held sacred every year in my annual operating budget. And one of the pieces that I have held sacred is the work to be able to have the appropriate government-based advocacy work, because we know that we need it. And I tell my board frequently, dollar to dollar, it's the best money we're spending.
Mm.
And I mean that, because it's not just that, so far, that's brought in a little over $1.5 million, I think, over the years now, right? It's, when I had to look at your list, because you sent it to me the other day, and I was like, holy moly, look at us, right?
Yeah.
And that's a great thing, because it means that the dollars that we have invested, and more importantly, the time, energy, and effort from the entire organization is making a difference. And it's not just the dollars, because now we actually have a voice at a lot of policy and advocacy work that's really, really meaningful to us as an organization in the state.
Yeah, that's great. Great. Okay, so let's bring the slides back up. We're going to quickly wrap up. We got a couple of slides to do, and then we want to open it up to questions. I see someone's already posted a question that hopefully Andrea or Becky, you can track and ask that. So just wanted to close out with ROI on government engagement advocacy effort. So for every dollar spent, 115 is gained by nonprofits. And this is according to a study. This is not numbers we're just making up. So there's a ton of well-spent dollars when it comes to advocacy work. Next slide, please. And then just some final takeaways for you: knowing your needs, really understanding what it is you need to get out of government before you start those conversations is really important. Learning how that process works, doing the targeting lists, whether it's the agency, public officials, federal, state, local, make sure all that's really organized. You've got messaging down. Annelise talked a lot about that, having that messaging and even having to reorient the messaging once they started the government efforts. We do these with white papers that lay out problem, solution, results. You want to have policy proposals if there's a policy you're trying to shape. Think about that media, social media engagement. All these things are part of that effort and your communication. You want to build those relationships and nourish them over time. As you heard, also constant engagement is really important. And then understanding and contributing to even rulemaking, regulatory side of things, not just the legislative side, but that's when you can submit letters either supporting or opposing new regulations. Those actually do have impact. Testifying at hearings, that's really key, especially in the State House. When you're making a submission for an earmark, you want to get down there and testify and be part of those hearings. Doing those tours are really key. Engaging the community you serve in a grassroots mobilization effort. Get them to send letters in, get them to come with you to the State House, get them to do these days Zoom calls, whatever it is. Have them engage and really have their voice be part of the process. It's actually very empowering and very compelling. It's very hard for legislators to turn away a constituent telling them how important this service is. Be persistent, succinct, and clear. Very, very important. Follow up, stay in touch, be aware of politics. I think that's it. And we can go back to Q&A, and I will pass to Becky or Andrew if you want to lead us through the Q&A.
Sure. Let's see, we do have a question here. Do we have a sense of what type of process may take place in the legislature in the spring around federal ARPA dollars and potentially infrastructure or Build Back Better dollars? We've heard there may be a quasi mid-biennium review around these funds that would be happening concurrently with the capital budget. We're hearing similar type of feedback on that. There's definitely Ohio has, I think it's $800 million yet of ARPA to spend at the state level and to allocate. There's lots of ongoing conversations about how to do that. Obviously, that with the infrastructure bill just passing and Build Back Better, we'll see what happens with that at the congressional level. But we're hearing similar. Andrea, if you have any else to add there, I'm not sure exactly about timing yet.
I couldn't unmute. Yeah. Oh, I would have said the same thing. That's also what we're hearing. I think the timeline is still a little shaky for the top of next year.
Other questions? There's no silly questions. They're all good questions.
We did have someone ask what PAST stood for, and I typed it into the box, but I just love what it stands for. It stands for Partnering Anthropology with Science and Technology. So I want to share that with everyone because I love that.
We will be sending out a copy of the slides. That question always comes up many times, and, as well as having the recording available online. Any other questions?
How about when should people get started? What do you think, Becky? When do they need to get started if they've got a state capital request?
Right now.
Yeah, I'd say now. Definitely have your planning in place. Again, for state capital, particularly for community projects, having matching dollars, while not set in statute, it is very, very helpful. So getting that your ducks in a row in terms of being able to share with your legislators what those matching dollars are, understanding what is a eligible. State capital is definitely a unique beast in terms of eligibility. You know, bricks and mortar, some equipment is eligible if it has a lifespan longer than 5 years. There are different accounts for many nonprofits. The account that you have to go through is higher education, so you have to have a nexus to the state, as Andrea mentioned earlier, through a state university or college or community college. So you have to be able to share that with your legislators. What's happened over the years is a lot of organizations are unable to spend, like they succeed in getting the earmark in the capital budget bill, but to a point Annelise raised earlier, then going through the process of establishing the joint use agreement with the institution of higher education, that process is cumbersome and has to get signed off on by the Ohio Department of Higher Education. And in some cases, organizations have a lot of trouble with that for a whole host of reasons. And so they then have to get that funding reappropriated into the next year. And so legislators, particularly the House and Senate budget directors, are looking for projects where that will not be a problem long-term, to the extent that that can be avoided. And there are other accounts, of course. You'll see, if you look at community project, you'll see that there are arts and cultural institutions that get funding year after year. They have a specific account for those types of projects. Similarly with funding that goes through ODNR, the Ohio Department of Natural Resources, for like parks and recreation. So they don't have quite the same process, but again, it has to be eligible.
Well, I'll just do the Q&A here. So I appreciate the tidbits that you shared with Chairman Matt Dolan that you were chatting with earlier. Andrea, I'm wondering, from your perspective as a more recent staffer in the State House, what did you think about those who came to you last minute, came to you at the end of January versus those who came now? Like, what's your perspective from being a staffer?
Yeah, I would say the most difficult thing about people coming in last minute is we have to, well, like we, when I was a staffer in the offices, they have to make sure those projects are eligible. And sometimes if you have questions about whether or not it would be eligible and you're turning something in last minute or too late or behind a deadline or something like that, the office just does not have the time to figure out if your project is eligible, and it will get thrown out just for that reason. I can remember having stacks of paper all around the office and trying to figure out which were eligible and which were not. And sometimes if you just don't have the time to figure it out, things will get thrown out for that reason. The other thing is that the later it comes in, the less time we have to ask questions. I can tell you that my boss would go through and read every single capital budget request that we got. And there were sometimes, 60, 70 of those that takes a lot of time. And we would start asking questions. And if, we get something, we don't have enough time to get the question, or they don't respond back in time or something like that, again, it falls down on the list or it gets thrown out just because we can't work fast enough to get the questions answered to find out how we should rank them. And that rank is really important. I think this was mentioned, but typically what legislators do is each legislator gets a meeting time with the finance chairman or, something like that. And they sit down and they say, these are my top 5, 10, well, however many projects. So it's really important that if you're in the Cleveland delegation, that they're saying your project over and over and over and over and over again to the legislators, because that's how you're going to end up on their list, because you're on everybody else's list.
That's really helpful. So Annelise, from your perspective, how do you budget for an earmark? Do you include it in your budget plans, or do you put it as a hopeful? Like, how do you plan for that?
Yeah, that's a really great question. So we have a continuous forecasting and pipeline process that we set up as a nonprofit. And so we account for every single proposal that has been submitted, right? But we are very cautious, however, recognizing what it takes, to get these things across the line and to actually be funded. From a budgeting standpoint, we think about them as hopeful opportunities, and we craft a budget based on what it will take for us to do that if it comes in. But it becomes a special project within our operating budget. I guess that's the long and short of it. That way, if it, for some reason, the funding doesn't come in, it doesn't impact our overall operating budget for any given year.
Okay, I think that's helpful for folks.
Yeah, and then I think the other thing I would suggest folks think about is, these things can come in, and then, you heard that they can take a lot of time to get through all the different pieces and processes. So you may have it in a timeline at one point, but the reality is you may not even be able to start it until much later, which impacts everything that you're able to do, all of which ties back to capacity. And as a nonprofit organization, oftentimes those nonprofits bump up against capacity and scale over and over again. So I just caution folks to be really, really mindful about the way you think about these opportunities.
Yeah, very important. Well, we are coming up on our time. I don't know if there's a final question. And if there is not a final question, I open it to final thoughts from anyone of our esteemed panelists today. I don't see any questions. Becky, do you want to say some final thoughts?
My final thought is just the, extreme privilege it is for the work that we get to do with organizations like Past Foundation in representing them in front of these decision makers. And it really brings us so much joy, and it's so meaningful. So thank you to Annelise for the opportunity. And, I would just say, yeah, thank you. And I think Annelise has mentioned a few times, but that continuous drumbeat of communication with your state legislators, with your Congress people, is so important. You can derive value from that in many ways. Metrics of the dollars and cents are easy to portray, but I think when we hopped on the phone earlier this year with the state, the state house finance chairman, who is, not in an area that represents Past Foundation. He says, "Oh yeah, we know Past Foundation. We know you do good work." Like right off the bat, it was just, it was exciting to hear that. So yeah. Anyway, thank you.
It works.
Yeah, it works, and thank you for sticking with us and for being here today.
Awesome. All right, Andrea, any final thoughts?
I was going to say similar to Becky says. I always say you can't have too many friends in government. Having friends, and your legislators can be your friends too. We had a similar situation with Senator Dolan, the Senate Finance Chairman. We got on a call, and in the first 3 minutes, he goes, "Well, this is going to be really easy because I'm putting this request in at the full amount." So, I mean, like, all right, well, 10-minute conversation then, because he already knew them. So when you have friends and people like you, and people know you do good work like the Past Foundation, it makes your life easier.
Awesome. All right. Annelise, any final words?
Oh, just thank you for having me, and to everybody who came to the webinar today. Persistence, be persistent and be present, and find great folks to help you. I am ever grateful to have had the opportunity to meet Liz many years ago now, and to form this relationship with G2G, because it's nice to have the team right by your side. So Thank you.
Well, thank you. Right back at you. Thank you all for dialing in. We will send you a link so you can watch this if you would like to watch it again or share with others in your organization. We will send you the slides as well. And if we can be helpful at any time, please let us know. Have a wonderful Thanksgiving. Thank you so much. Bye-bye.
Bye.
Thank you.